Welcome and thank you for joining. My name is Ravi Erukulla. I'm a VP of Strategy at Saviynt. I'm also the co-chair of IAM working group at CSA. Today, we are diving into one of the most overlooked yet the most critical aspect of identity and access management, non-human identities. There is a great imbalance of identities today. The attack surface has shifted dramatically. We have far more non human identities than humans. Yet, our IAM tools and practices are still very human centric. This poses a great question, right, and a need. But before that, let's take a minute to understand the shift that's causing this imbalance. Now, IAM traditionally has evolved to the shifts in the broader IT landscape, the business needs, the enterprise IT architecture, or what have you. Right? If you go back a few decades, in 1980s to begin with, IAM was mainly about efficiency, mainly due to the revolution in client server computing back then. It was all about efficiency. In 2000s, after 20 years or so, in 2000s, it was all about compliance. Efficiency still mattered, but compliance was the primary driver. And then also the cloud transformation accelerated that transformation. And then now it's all about managing the attack surface. It's all about ensuring that there are no identity threats. And then particularly ensuring that we have a handle on non-human identities. The last 2 weeks took about 20 years, but I don't think this wave will take 20 years. You are already seeing a lot of progress with AI over the last couple of years in particular. And then the non human identities in reality, they're not new, they've been existing for a long time. It's just that now, because of what's happening in Gen AI in particular and the agentic AI solutions, the industry is starting to take a look at them. The industry is starting to realize that this is a big problem, and then they are starting to recognize. But as I mentioned, in reality, it's been an existing problem. But again, yet uh, all our identity centric processes are human centric. So, in the next 25 minutes, we'll unpack what non human identities are, why they're quietly becoming one of the biggest blind spots in identity and access management, and what practical steps we can take to ensure we bring the visibility and control and governance to this overlooked layer of access. But before that, I mean, what exactly are these non-human identities? Now, an identity in general is a set of one or more attributes that uniquely describes them. It could be a person, it could be an organization, or it could be a device, etc. If you look at those attributes, for human, they are email address, names, and then you also have credentials, of course. But for non-human, there could be IP addresses or any other characteristics that is actually describing them. Humans are associated with individuals, whereas non-humans are associated with devices, digital workloads, or other entities. I categorize them broadly into two sections: devices and digital workloads. Devices include laptops, smartphones, servers, operational technology devices, IoT devices, printers, scanners, or others. And digital workloads are services, applications, your VMs, containers, RPA bots, APIs, but also the agentic AI solutions that are going to explode or are already are. So any identity which is giving access to these devices or to these digital workloads are called non-human identities. So what's the big deal about it? Right? I mean, why is this so important to even tackle? And how are they different from human identities? So if you look at a broad categorization. First of all, human identities have a clear source of record, right? They come from HR system, but non-human identities, on the other hand, do not. They are fragmented. Anybody could create them at any given point of time, right? They are created by tools. They're created by DevOps folks, developers, or who have. And from a life cycle perspective, non-human identities are unpredictable, whereas human identities are. So that's a big, but that's a big deal to even know that there are still non-human identities that existed. And then the way they are onboarded, the way you actually get hold of them from a visibility perspective, it changes drastically. Also from how they are accessing other non-human identities, other services, or other resources. You could enforce multi-factor authentication, for example, to humans, but non-humans you cannot. You have a clear definition of who owns a particular identity within a human space, but non-human space, it's often not clear. And sometimes, or more than often, it's hard. Multiple people own it, or it's just nobody owns it. Nobody knows where that non-human identity came from. And these causes a bunch of challenges, if you will, right? Particularly from credential sprawl. Like I said, they can come from anywhere. Anybody could create them. There is no handle on knowing them, and there is no handle on ensuring that they are cleaned up when they are not needed. There is no control. Lack of control is a big issue, again, in non-human identities. And then their perpetual existence. With a human, particularly in an enterprise world, you join a company, you move to a different roles, and then you leave the company. So the life cycle is pretty clear. But non-human identities, somebody creates them, they're used for some purpose. Who knows whether they have been decommissioned or they still exist even after the person who has requested or who has created left the company. So there's no defined life cycle. And then they could become stale. Nobody could be using them, but they're available for attacks. And then they could also be potential targets for reuse for a different purpose than what they were intended for. It all results into data breaches, right? It's easy to escalate privileges using non-human identities. You can then laterally move and then commit a data breach. Right? That's the real security threat. And then that's what we are after. And then that's impacting directly humans, the organization, the brand value, even though the risk might have been arised from non-humans. What are the best practices to handle non-human identities? I categorize them broadly into 5 different categories, starting with discovery, then lifecycle management, vaulting and authentication of non-human identities, then the governance and ownership of them, and continuous controls and monitoring. So let's take a look at each of these best practices. And then again, it's not impossible to manage non-human identities. It's just that it has to be a concerted effort. It has to be embedded into the strategy and not being an afterthought. And then that starts with discovery. Non-human identities can manifest anywhere. Like anybody could create them. Your DevOps, your SRE, your automation tools, anybody could create them. So without a focused effort, to identify, to discover them, they are invisible. So start with that, start with discovery and make it a continuous process, not just one-time thing. Automate it, automate discovery, use tools, and then there are a lot of tools available today that you can use. Identify backdoors. These are often very difficult to identify. It's very easy for a developer to create a non-human identity, for example, and then use it for a particular purpose, whether it's for testing or what have you, that could end up into your production environment. And then the developer could leave or move on to a different project, but the non-human identity still remains there. And that is a big problem. So identify your backdoor identities, hard-coded credentials. Also identify your legacy identities. That's equally important. And then figure out a way to manage ephemeral identities. These are the ones which are very short-lived. They might be created based on a particular event. You could use them, or the system could use them, and then after that, they no longer exist. But it's very important to understand what has happened. If some fraud has been committed during that period, it's very important for you to know that that has happened. So again, start with discovery. It is absolutely important to know what exists. Without knowing what exists, you cannot secure them. Then lifecycle management. Every identity, whether it's human or non-human, it needs a clear life cycle. Provisioning, monitoring, rotating, revoking, otherwise you are building tech debt with every deployment, with every day, and then going forward with the agentic AI solutions, it would even amplify. So formalize the process of provisioning, deprovisioning, key rotation. Essentially what you're doing is formalizing the joiner, mover, lever process for non-human identities, similar to how you would have done for humans. Reduce manual compliance to the extent possible, automate using tools, issuance of non-human identities, renewal and revocation as well. Implement a centralized systems so that you have complete visibility into all non-human identities, no matter where they're coming from, and then what their state is, right? And whether they are still needed or not. Also differentiate between what kind of non-human identities they are. Are they device identities? Are they workload identities? And then there are subtle differences and then nuances between these two on how you treat them and then how they are used. For example, a device could be retired, and hopefully if you have good process in place, the non-human identities associated with that device will go away. But whereas workload, it won't. Like just a different thought process, different mentality, and different way of managing them. And equally important, guide your cross-functional teams, your development team, your infrastructure and operational team, your DevOps team, security teams, so that they realize the importance of managing non-human identities right from the beginning. And then ideally, there should not be any hard-coded or any static credentials anywhere. And that's the ultimate goal when it comes to non-human identities. Governance and ownership is a very critical part of managing these. Secrets should never be email or hard coded, as I mentioned. Vaulting with automation and authentication is also equally important. It's pretty much a table stakes now, and then you should never see any hard coded email or hard coded credentials, whether it's in the script, whether it's in a code, or whether it's in an email. So implement a secure key orchestration mechanism for all your non-human identities. Centralize them. Centralize all keys that you use, certificates into, particularly keys into HSMs or key vaults. Reduce static credentials to the extent possible. Your ultimate goal should be to eliminate all of them, but again, it will take time. It may not be possible right from the get-go. So reduce them and then use time-bound tokens or just-in-time secrets. And then again, if you have a central vault or a privileged access management system, you could depend on them, on that, to request these keys on the fly through non-human services, workloads, or what have you. And then automate secret rotation. Again, you should eliminate having standing keys or standing secrets, but if you really need to, then make sure that those secrets are being rotated in an automatic fashion continuously. And most importantly, reduce human access to these non-human identities. Nobody should have access to these secrets or keys except by exception. And when you really need to grant them access, then use privileged access management tool again, and then provide privileged access so their activity is tagged. They only get time-bound access and not forever. Essentially, follow all the identity-centric approaches that you would follow to a traditional human when it comes to vaulting and authentication of keys. Similarly, enforce them to non-human identities as well. Moving on, as I mentioned, governance and ownership is a key pillar. Clearly knowing who owns a particular non-human identity is very important. Oftentimes, what happens is, if I'm a developer, I create a secret and then I move on. It's hard coded somewhere, or I requested a service account for a particular reason that has happened, but then I moved on, right? Nobody knows what happens to the service account, what happens to that credential, or what happens to your particular certificate or key. So making sure that for each and every non-human identity, first of all, discover them, and then for each and every non-human identity, make sure you have a defined owner. Make sure you have somebody who's accountable for that particular non-human identity. There should not be any non-human identities which are stale or which do not have any owners at all. Apply least principal privileges. Enforce just-in-time access, similar to how you would do for human identities, for non-humans identities as well. Make sure you have crypto modularity in application development. As I mentioned, there should not be any hard-coded stuff as part of your development. That should be taken care by an external tool, again, such as privileged access management or key management system. Continuously review access periodic certifications, ad hoc certifications, event-based certifications, or what have you, but continuously review access of non-human identities exactly the way you would do for human identities. Right size those permissions. Make sure you are eliminating all the permissions which are not needed. Again, make sure that you are meeting all regulatory compliances even with non-human identities. Enforce separation of duties, prevent toxic combinations within non-human identities, but also if I own a non-human identity, then the combination of my access and the non-human identity that I own, its access should not be allowed to execute a toxic combination of transactions. That's super important. And then also make sure that no non-human identity has admin level permissions. They are there for a specific reason, specific purpose, and that's about it. Not to create new non-human identities or not to change roles, permissions, or what have you. And then lastly, make sure you have continuous controls and monitorings in place. Particularly, as I mentioned, there is no clear owner for non-human identities. Does IT own it? Maybe is IT the source of HR? Maybe humans you have clear HR source, but for non-humans there is no. So it's very important to make sure that you have a program in place to monitor and audit continuously. Apply anomaly detection for unusual access for non-human identities, similar to how you would do for human. There are different constraints. There is no time constraint, for example, when it comes to non-human identities. So the way you apply what the definition of anomalous behavior changes a bit from humans to non-humans, but that's super important to do so. Periodically detect and disable compromised identities, tail identities particularly, right, orphan identities in particular, and integrate non-human identity management into your overall security strategy. As I mentioned earlier, this cannot be an afterthought. And then document all your non-human identity access, particularly when it relates to outages. If there is any, why it happened, when it happened, and is it okay? And at the end, monitor privilege escalations in particular. If something is happening, if access is elevating for a particular non-human identity, you should be knowing that, and then you should be having a way to track that malicious behavior and mitigate that. We have gone through best practices. We have gone through what are the challenges in particular, and then how do you handle those using best practices, right? There are a lot of tools. You're not alone. There are tools available to help you. My ask for you to is recognize that non-human identity, protecting them can look like a daunting task, but it's not. There are tools available. It's just that it cannot be a bolt on. It has to be part of your identity protection right from the beginning. Start small, but start now. Start with discovery to begin with, because that is where gives you visibility. With again, no, without knowing what you have, you cannot secure them. Then prioritize managing high risk access. As I mentioned, eliminate standing privileges to the extent possible, but when you just cannot, then prioritize what you really want to keep and rotate those secrets for those non-human identities. And then continuously monitor your identity security stack. And as I mentioned, you do not need to do it all this by yourself. There are a lot of modern tools available. And then this is an example from our company, Saviynt, on non-human identities. It begins by giving you a security posture of all the non-human identities, what state they are, whether they are orphaned, whether they have any potential risks within them, and then also categorization of what kind of non-human identities they are. Right, then you can really delve into them and assign them owners, assign them controls, policies, or what have you, depending on their type of non-human identity. With that, I want you to live with this. No, non-human identities are first-class citizens, similar to human identities. To treat them that way, they cannot be an afterthought. Treat them that way, and they'll stop being the weakest link in your identity strategy. Thank you.